Why did President Obama and Vice President Biden support the coup of Ukraine in 2014? In Biden's words, it was to pass a trade deal. Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about Ukraine again and just what was the U.S. Obama administration doing in Ukraine in 2014, 2013 and 2014 when it was attempting to pass a Ukraine EU European Union trade deal. With all of the trade deals underway by President Donald Trump since 2017, it's hard to believe that the civil war in Ukraine that began in 2014 actually started out as a policy disagreement between a pair of competing trade deals, one with the European Union, the other with Russia. At the time, the president of Ukraine was Viktor Yanukovych, and Joe Biden, former vice president at the time, who was in charge of the Obama administration's Ukraine policy, wrote in his book, he details how Yanukovych is overthrown over this trade agreement. In his book, Promise Me, Dad, A Year of Hope, Hardship, and Purpose, published in 2017. So let's take a look at this. This is, again, from Joe Biden in his words. The Ukrainian people, quote, have been on a thrilling and sometimes harrowing roller coaster for the previous year, and I felt like I had been on it with them. What started that popular demonstration, which started at a square in Kyiv in late 2013, when Viktor Yanukovych reneged on his promise to take the country into the European Union, had grown from a spontaneous eruption to a real political movement. One President Yanukovych mishandled badly. Now, Biden goes on to recount the last of his urgent phone calls. Quote, I made the last of many urgent phone calls to Yanukovych in late 2014 when his snipers were assassinating Ukrainian citizens by the dozens, and we had credible reports that he was contemplating an even more vicious crackdown. I had been warning him for months to exercise restraint in dealing with his citizens, but on this night, 3 months into the demonstrations, I was telling him it was over. Time for him to call off his gunmen and walk away. His only real supporters were his political patrons and his operators in the Kremlin, I reminded him, and he shouldn't expect his Russian friends to rescue him from this disaster. Yanukovych had lost the confidence of the Ukrainian people, I said, and he was going to be judged harshly if he kept killing them. The disgraced president fled Ukraine the next day, owing to the courage and determination of the demonstrators, etc., etc. Now, this actually sounds a lot like Biden's opposition and to the prosecutor general that he had fired in 2016. This was the same prosecutor who was investigating Hunter Biden's company, Burisma Holdings, a natural gas firm in Ukraine, for corruption, and which Hunter Biden served as one of the board of directors. Biden was bragging about this to the Council of Foreign Relations in 2018, and it seems to rhyme with that. That seems very similar to me. But by Biden's account, it was his pressure that prompted Yanukovych to flee. Now, here he's referring to, with this trade deal, the Ukraine European Union Association Agreement. Now, this had been proposed, and it was something that Ukraine's President Yanukovych was considering at the time. Paul Manafort was, as you may recall, Yanukovych's advisor. Paul Manafort, the same Paul Manafort that the special counsel Robert Mueller brought up on financial and tax crimes dating to his time in Ukraine, had actually advised that Yanukovych do the trade deal with the European Union. But Yanukovych rejected Manafort's advice, and what followed was a revolution in Ukraine that ultimately ousted Yanukovych from power in 2014, embroiling Ukraine in civil war that led directly to the annexation of Crimea by Russia and several separatist uprisings in eastern Ukraine that continue to date. The country's been cut in half. Yanukovych fled to Russia on February 22, 2014, and the trade deal was signed in March of 2014. Now, this was by the interim administration, so a lot happened in just a few short weeks in early 2014. First, the President Yanukovych is overthrown after refusing to do this trade deal, and there was this protests in the square of Ukraine. capital, Kyiv, and the Independence Square, and then the interim administration, which the U.S. backed, immediately signs this trade deal. So was the overthrow of Yanukovych to get this trade deal signed? That's what we're looking at today. By Biden's account, it was his pressure that prompted Yanukovych to leave. Biden appears proud of his role in deposing both the prosecutor general in 2016 and the president of Ukraine in 2014. Following the bloodbath in the streets of Kyiv in 2014, Biden was talking about snipers. In his book, he's referring to the infamous Maidan massacre that took place on February 20th. 2014. This was the flashpoint for the beginning of the Ukrainian civil war. What began as peaceful protests in favor of the trade deal turned bloody when snipers began firing and killing dozens of protesters and police officers. At the time, per Biden's account, within hours of the shootings, the U.S. was blaming Yanukovych and his police forces, and who was impeached within 2 days and then promptly fled the country to Russia. Now, in April of 2014, the interim post-Yanukovych government issued a report that mirrored the U.S. position, that the Yanukovych administration and the police were responsible for the shootings. A 2018 investigative report by the New York Times outlined the efforts of the Ukrainian prosecutors in reconstructing what happened in the square, also finding the police were responsible. So let's take a look at that. There's two sides to every story, and here we're going to listen into what the New York Times found and what the Ukrainian prosecutors are saying about the Yanukovych police.
The protests in Ukraine that began in 2013 not only toppled the government, but also yielded countless eyewitness videos. Day after day, protesters and bystanders filmed the rallies in Kyiv against Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych. They filmed attempts by security forces to break apart the tent city that was built in Independence Square, and the clashes with masked police that reached a violent tipping point months later. On February 20th, 4 police and 48 protesters were killed in one of the bloodiest hours of European conflict since the Cold War ended. Now, 4 years later, these videos are being presented as critical evidence against Ukrainian policemen who stand charged of killing these protesters. Working with incomplete ballistics evidence and amid rumours and denials about what happened, prosecutors hope that a forensic analysis of the videos will prove their case. They enlisted the help of Situ Research, an architectural firm in Brooklyn with expertise in video forensics. Situ analysed hundreds of videos assembled by Ukrainian graduate student Evelyn Nefertari to recreate the shootings in painstaking detail. First, they built a virtual replica of Institutska Street, where most of the protesters were shot. Laser scanners were used to accurately reconstruct the fine detail of buildings, sidewalks, and trees. And they modelled barricades and debris seen in the videos of that day. Videos show the Berkut, a Ukrainian paramilitary force, retreating along the street from clashes with protesters. The Berkut are wearing these distinctive yellow armbands. They take up position behind these barricades. We'll focus here on the death of Igor Dmitriev, a 30-year-old lawyer who had joined the protests the day before. He was with this group of protesters, protected by helmets and homemade shields, who followed the Berkut. Moments later, he was fatally shot. His shooting was filmed by 3 cameras, which helped Situ determine his precise position and that of the cameras. By analysing the sound of the gunshot, experts approximated the distance of the weapon from the cameras. And using their 3D model, analysts froze the victim's exact position when he was shot. They marked the entry and exit wounds described in the autopsy report to indicate a direction of fire within a few degrees of accuracy. Overlaying this cone of fire with the audio analysis gave the experts an approximate location of the shooter. Next, they examined videos filmed on either side of the barricade at the time of the shooting. One shows the fatal shot and a white puff of smoke rising near the barricade. And this is security footage recorded behind the barricade within a minute of that gunshot. It clearly shows Berkut police aiming and firing at protesters, where experts say the fatal shot was fired from. Investigators repeated the analysis for 2 other victims. Lawyers hope that, by making order out of the chaos and disinformation surrounding that day, this innovative analysis will stand up to cross-examination in court.
So that's the New York Times report. And again, it details what the Ukrainian prosecutors are looking at when they're saying that the Yanukovych forces, the police, were shooting at the protesters. Very clearly in this video, you can see them shooting at the protesters. Now, but there are other accounts that have pinned blame on variously the protesters, Russia, or even anti-Yanukovych neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine that were in favor of the protest. As Ukraine on Fire, a controversial documentary by Oliver Stone and Igor Lopatonok does, suggesting a tie-in to these right-wing extremist groups who opposed Yanukovych. This is you can go to ukraineonfire.com. It's an interesting documentary, and I think it gives you kind of another. There's 2 sides to every story. This gives you another side of it. What we're going to look at right now, though, these accounts mirror an investigation led by University of Ottawa professor Ivan Kachanovsky, who wrote a 2015 paper that the attacks were, this is again the 2015 paper, and he found that the attacks were actually, quote, rationally planned and carried out with a goal of the overthrow of the government and seizure of power. It found various evidence of the involvement of an alliance of the far-right organizations, specifically the right sector and Svoboda, and oligarchic parties such as Fatherland. Concealed shooters and spotters were located in at least 20 Maidan-controlled buildings or areas. The various evidence that the protesters were killed from these locations includes some 70 testimonies, primarily by Maidan protesters, several videos of snipers targeting protesters from these buildings, comparisons of positions of the specific protesters at the time of their killing and their entry wounds, and bullet impact signs. The study uncovered various videos and photos of armed Maidan snipers and spotters in many of these buildings. And these accounts, in turn, mirror accounts of Yanukovych and the Russian Foreign Ministry, saying there were other shooters there. And so now the BBC in 2015 interviewed a man who said he was one of those snipers and was recruited to do the shootings, and that he was operating out of a building that was in control of the anti-Yanukovych pro-Maidan supporters. So let's take a look at that.
The question of what really happened that day goes to the heart of a confrontation that has led to the most dangerous standoff between Russia and the West since the end of the Cold War. The protest leaders, many of whom now hold positions of power in the new Ukraine, have always maintained that full responsibility for the shootings lies with the security forces acting on behalf of the previous government. Our investigations suggest that is not the full picture. Only 3 people have been arrested over the killings, all of them members of this police unit, seen here firing towards the protesters. But that was after 9 o'clock in the morning, as the police retreated from the square. What happened before that? What prompted them to pull back? Earlier that morning, Andrei Shevchenko, then an opposition politician and part of the protest movement known as Maidan, had received a call from the police commander on the square.
He calls me and he says, "Andrei, someone is shooting at my guys." And he said that the shooting was from the conservatory. He said, "Second floor, it's firearms, and please do something about that, because it's getting really bad."
Amid the chaos, Mr. Shevchenko contacted the man in charge of security at the protest camp. He remembers the shots coming from somewhere different.
Выстрелы шли со стороны гостиницы «Украина», и было тяжело точно увидеть откуда. Иногда казалось, что они идут как бы не с гостиницы, из гостиницы тоже, но идут из-за гостиницы «Украина».
The location matters. The Hotel Ukraine was that morning largely under the control of government forces, but the conservatory building, several hundred meters away, was firmly in the hands of the protesters. Just after 8 o'clock that morning, a news photographer had managed to get into the building with his camera.
When I come inside, I saw the guys. One come after me with just a hunting rifle, and I saw the guy with the Kalashnikov. And after that, I come outside and saw the other guys who was also with the guns. Some of them lying on the floor, some of them hiding behind the columns on the second floor. And after that, the guys saw me and said, "Go out, go out."
On the morning of the 20th, there were persistent reports of gunfire coming from the conservatory building. Now, for the first time, one of those gunmen has spoken on camera. He was part of the protest movement, he said, and agreed to talk to us on condition that we disguise his identity. We will call him Sergei.
It was the Maidan security people who gathered us and asked, if it comes to it, who here can shoot? And I said, I can shoot. So they said, okay, if there's no other way out, then you will do this work.
That was on the 19th. Earlier that day, Sergei had been told to meet a man on the edge of the protest camp who appeared carrying a box.
He had brought a 12 caliber shotgun, lots of ammunition, and a Saiga.
That's a rifle that fires high-velocity rounds similar to a standard Kalashnikov.
I took that weapon off him. It had a sight attached. I know how to use this gun because I served in the army.
Early in the morning of the 20th, as the first shots rang out, Sergei was escorted into the conservatory building and up onto the second-floor balcony. Sergei says that he took up a position behind one of these pillars here, and he mentions being able to see that clock over there on the far side of the square on the bank and the edge of the shopping centre, which was the part of the square that was controlled by the riot police. So from here, he had a bird's eye view right over the front line.
I was shooting downwards at their feet. Of course, I could have hit them in the arm or anywhere, but I didn't shoot to kill. I also shot upward at the police who were on the top of the Globus shopping center, and that is why they retreated.
The Maidan commander told us he sent his men to search the conservatory building as soon as he got the phone call.
Разделение пошло, они прошли все этажи. Где-то через полчаса они пришли и сказали, что с консерватории нет никаких огневых точек.
But Sergei tells a different story. He says he and another gunman were shooting for about 20 minutes when some men came and dragged them away.
I was just reloading. They ran up to me, and one put his foot on top of me and said, "They want a word with you. Everything is okay, but stop doing what you're doing."
Sergei says he was driven to the outskirts of the city and left to make his own way home. By that time, 3 policemen were dead, and the massacre of protesters had begun.
So there you see another account that tells you that there was at least 2 groups of shooters. One, you can see in the prior video, the police shooting back towards the protesters, responsible for a great number of the deaths that occurred. But that prior to that, per the BBC report, there were shooters in these buildings who were actually there on behalf of the protesters. So very clearly, the accounts here, I think that what they demonstrate is that there were shooters on both sides, which with an armed conflict, a civil war that's about to break out, is not at all surprising. Now, in 2018, Ivan Bubenchik, a Maidan protester, was arrested for the shootings that occurred from the buildings after reportedly admitting to the shootings in a 2016 interview with another reporter with identical details to the BBC report. He appears to be the same man. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's one of his comrades there. But that you can see this man was arrested and then he's released almost immediately. And it was his interview with Katya Gorchinskaya in 2016 that prompts this. He's speaking to reporters. He wants to get his side of the story out. And then in 2019, the Prosecutor General's office has once again stopped the investigation of Bubinchik. And I think this accounts for the back and forth with those who were saying, no, there were other shooters besides the police. Now, the same 2015 BBC report quoted, on the other hand, Andrei Poruby, at the time Deputy Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament and former Commandant of Maidan, saying it was Russia who organized the snipers, speaking of those on the buildings. Quote, and this is translated from Ukrainian, quote, the shootings on the 20th were carried out by snipers who arrived from Russia and controlled by Russia. The fact that the shooting was aimed at both Maidan self-defense units and at riot police leads me to believe that those shooting were aiming to orchestrate a bloodbath. Now, Biden's version of events, the official U.S. position was that Yanukovych and his police forces were shooting against their own people, including apparently the police. But the different accounts, I think, call into question what really occurred that day. Clearly, there's shooters on both sides. Again, it's a civil war. That's not surprising. But the shooters in favor of those protests remains a mystery because, as to date, nobody has been prosecuted, and the attempts to bring some of these men to justice are being blocked by the Prosecutor General's office in Ukraine. But members of the police have been tried and convicted as they were those who were shooting. You saw the video as they were shooting on the ground as they were withdrawing from the scene. Now, leaving all that aside, clearly there's no angels here. Within days of the shooting, Biden was put in charge of Ukraine policy. He wanted Yanukovych out and the EU trade deal adopted, and the siege of the Capitol and the shootings specifically were certainly what gave them the blood in the streets that they needed to get it done. Within days of the shootings, Yanukovych was gone. He was impeached within 2 days. Imagine that. You have an investigation that occurs by a parliament. The shootings happened on February 20th. And he's removed from office by February 22. Biden talks to him on February 21 saying it's time to go. And within a month, the trade deal is signed in March of 2014. So basically a month goes by. You've removed the president. You get the trade deal that Yanukovych said he didn't want. In the meantime, Russia's annexing Crimea. Crimea had a referendum, said they saw what was going on in Kyiv. They said, not here. We're going to go with Russia. And so then the country splits in half on the eastern provinces saying we're going to go with Russia, and the western provinces remaining loyal to Kyiv. But the U.S. role on the ground in Ukraine, I think has been pretty well documented, again, by the BBC, that this U.S.-backed interim government was one that the State Department helped to install. Specifically, BBC documented a phone call with Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland that was apparently intercepted, probably by Russia, outlining U.S. efforts to put in place a new government in early 2014. And now Nuland stated the preference for Arseniy Yatsenyuk to be in the new government, and was ultimately made prime minister and signed a trade deal in March of 2014. So here's the transcript that was leaked. And here she's speaking about this person who becomes the prime minister. And so she says that, quote, I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. So now Biden, he wrote in favor of the armed overthrow of the government in his book. He said, quote, the protesters in the Maidan found themselves in a war zone, enduring a brutal 3-month siege in the dead of winter. They refused to back down, even in the face of death, and transformed the square where the protests began into an armed camp. Demonstrators seized government administration buildings and erected barricades so they could set up command centers, mess halls, and aid stations for people beaten and bloodied by Yanukovych's uniformed police and his secret plainclothes thugs. The crowds of protesters grew to more than 50,000 and just kept growing. By the middle of February 2014, they were inching toward the Parliament building. That's when the shootings happened and Yanukovych was removed and the new U.S.-backed government installed. A month later, the trade deal is adopted. All of this to get a trade deal adopted. Biden was bragging about removing the prosecutor general in 2016 because, in his mind, he was small potatoes. Igor Shokin, compared to the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014 to muscle through the EU trade deal. And this rhymes with several U.S. interventions that occurred during the Obama administration in Libya, Egypt, and Syria. Kind of a similar pattern where the United States is toppling governments overseas. And I guess this is simply how the Obama administration did business. So really, it was a coup in Ukraine, and one that the U.S. unquestionably supported, with Biden emerging as the key player. He's kind of akin to a Roman provincial governor who bosses the tributary cities around. What followed the revolution and the trade deal was more corruption. Ukraine participated, and reports that Ukraine participated in its own election interference operations in 2016 in favor of Hillary Clinton. This was a Politico report in January of 2017 by Kenneth Vogel and David Stern, and it outlines pro-Clinton Ukrainian efforts, ostensibly appearing to as a part of this Spygate, this Russiagate fiasco, where President Trump was falsely accused by intelligence agencies and the Justice Department of being a Russian agent, and it just wasn't true. The Mueller report that came out just a few months ago found that President Trump was innocent all along. Quote, the Mueller report stated, quote, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities, and the evidence does not establish that the president was involved in an underlying crime related to Russian election interference. And so these were false allegations, and Ukraine could have been part of those efforts to make it look like Donald Trump was a Russian agent when he really wasn't. And maybe it was to cover up what took place with this EU trade deal and these shootings that occurred in Maidan. I think that this is something that Attorney General Barr, as he looks at the election interference, he may also want to take a look at what took place in Ukraine in the years leading up to 2016, because I think it provides essential background to providing a context for what was going on and why it was going on. Now, ultimately, what followed was also more corruption by the Poroshenko, Joe Biden's best friend in Ukraine. So eventually, comedian Volodymyr Zelensky is elected in a landslide basically on an anti-corruption platform. And people, obviously, in Ukraine, they don't like the civil war. Zelensky has stated that he wants to end the civil war. And that's going to require talks with Russia, with Moscow. The U.S. perhaps can serve as an intermediary there. And President Trump has also spoken in favor of peace talks, and I don't see any way around it. I mean, you could settle the civil war by making it a wider war, but that's probably going to get the U.S. involved with a war with Russia, and everyone knows that goes nuclear. So alternatively, you could pursue diplomacy, you can talk to Zelensky, which is what President Trump is doing. But as a result, and I'll leave you with the close here. Now, House Democrats are threatening the impeachment of President Donald Trump for simply asking the newly elected President Zelensky about Ukraine's potential role in the U.S. in the phony Russiagate investigation by Intel and Justice in 2016 that falsely accused Trump of being a Russian agent. I mean, this resulted in a civil war in Ukraine, and people are dying. The government was overthrown, and now they want to do the same thing here. That's the commentary. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.